Hi everyone, nice to see you all again today. It's Satinder, and we're talking today about easing restrictions for people who've been shielded during this COVID 19 pandemic. And this will possibly apply to a number of you. I understand there's a lot of interest in learning more about this particular issue and understanding what is the government really asking and suggesting, and on what basis is that happening, because I get the impression that not just you guys but a lot of people are getting confused by the messages that are coming out from government. So I thought I'd start by just talking a little bit about the COVID virus itself, because I don't know where you get your source of information, and there is a lot of very good, accurate information out there, but there's also some really bad, misleading information out on social media. So I thought I'd spend the first sort of few minutes just talking about the disease itself. So um, COVID 19 is the disease caused by the coronavirus, which is technically called the SARS CoV-2 virus. And it's basically it's a large spectrum of viral illnesses, and it includes things like SARS disease and MERS disease. Um, it transmits via large respiratory droplets, and also by direct or indirect contact with infected secretions. So it's really important that you avoid touching your face when you're out and about, because it can transmit through your mouth, your nose, your eyes, um, and even your ears. And that's why it is important to avoid touching your face. It's probably also transmitted in urine and feces. So, if you were to compare the different infections out there, both past and present, sort of common and less common, comparing it to things like chickenpox, measles, rotavirus, Ebola, bird flu, it sort of sits at the low to mid end for how infectious it is in terms of spreading, and also at the low end for deadliness, with things like bird flu, Ebola, and TB, polio, SARS, MERS, Spanish flu all being more deadly. Um, the viral R
There's
is
no sound.
the reproductive number. Oh,
There's no sound.
my face is there.
Yeah.
Oh man, what is it with our computer? It's useless.
Be careful what you say, just in case it is working.
Well, you said it isn't working.
Well, it's not working for me.
Mike, sorry everyone. My husband's just come in and said that it's not. There's no sound on this, so I'm just going to ring Greg. I really apologise. I don't know what's wrong with our computer system. It seems to let me down every week, and I can't apologise enough. And my husband's not sure, so I'm just going to ring Greg to
Oh,
double
sorry,
check.
it is working now. It's working now. It's working now. It's working now. It's working now.
Right, I don't. Yeah, I need to just. I'm just going to ring Greg because I'm not sure if you were able to hear me from the beginning. Okay, could you hear me from the beginning, Greg? Could you hear us from the beginning? All right. Okay. Sorry, it's just my husband said that he couldn't. Okay. Cheers. Okay, so apparently you can still hear me, so that's fine. So yes, the viral RO is the reproductive number, and it's the number of the disease, number of cases of the disease transmitting from one infected individual to others. So apparently, for the common flu, the R number is 1.2, and for this particular coronavirus, it's 2.4. And what that means is that for every person who gets the disease, it will then infect 2.4 other people. So, in terms of symptoms, the most common is fever and cough, followed by shortness of breath, and then then you get to the ones that are perhaps around the 50 below percentage mark, and those are things like muscle aches, being tired all the time, coughing up sputum, headache, coughing up blood, having altered disruption of your sense of smell and taste, and also having abdominal pains. In terms of stopping the virus, it's really important that you don't touch your face, particularly if you're out in public places, and that if you're over washing your hands, be wary of you getting cuts and things on your skin, because those can be sources for infection to get in. So regularly moisturize your hands, and coughing into your elbow as opposed to into your hand, and using a tissue so that you can reduce the spread of droplets. And of course, the other thing that we're now recommended to do when we're out in public, particularly on public transport or in public spaces like hospitals, is to wear face masks at all times. Avoid eating and drinking and smoking in public, because again, it's all this bringing your hand to your mouth, unless you can honestly say that between each time you're making sure your hands are infection free. And in terms of moving on, in terms of social distancing, which is what many of you have been asked to do during this pandemic, it's basically avoiding non-essential contact with other people and avoiding public transport. And in terms of at-risk groups, it's anybody over the age of 70, those under 70 who would otherwise be offered the flu because of other pre-existing conditions they may have. Pregnant women, it's more precautionary. They are a bit more immunosuppressed, but there's been no evidence that they're at more increased risk. And there are some complex conditions, those who are immunocompromised, those who have cancers, who are also being asked to shield. In terms of the age range and who's more or less susceptible, if you're between 0 and 10, then you're very unlikely to get the disease. And if you're over 60, then you're more susceptible, with the highest risk in being in the over 80s. Now, the R number will reduce because we have been in lockdown and because we've had less contact with other people. And as the rules relax, this R number is going to go back up again, because we are going to have more contact. And the bottom line is that we're probably going to be going in and out of lockdown throughout 2020. And for those of you that listened to the loneliness and social isolation podcast last week, you remember I talked about ways we can cope and deal with this and any sort of difficult situations we come across in life. And one thing that might help is for you to just accept that probably 2020 is going to be a not typical year in terms of movement and being able to do those sort of activities that would involve being with other people at close proximity. And then there will probably be within those times periods where the restrictions are relaxed. But I think if you bear in mind that this is a year of restricted social activity, then it will be less frustrating every time, hanging on to every word and every potential new change that's happening. And, changes are happening all the time, and we'll go through the actual wording of what you've been told. But bear in mind as well that this applies for June, and at the end of June, they're going to review the situation again for people like yourselves who are being shielded. And so the whole kind of state of affairs will change yet again, and it may change again after that. And we'll talk about that in more detail. In terms of those who are more at risk, if you've got cardiovascular disease, if you have diabetes, if you have chronic obstructive airways disease, or abnormally high blood pressure, or cancer, you are deemed to be in the more at-risk groups. There is a good emerging evidence that other factors are key players as well, and these include obesity, but also being very underweight, and also coming from the Black and ethnic minority community. If you have no pre-existing conditions, then your risk is less than 1%. Our cases in the UK, yes, they are high, but our death rate is relatively low compared to some other countries, because we have, better healthcare if we were to compare to sort of all the countries that have been measuring or collecting data. And of course, we have this new drug, well, very old drug, it's been around for decades, dexamethasone. And at the moment, there's a lot of cautious optimism in the medical world. They're a lot more optimistic in the media world, but in medicine, I think because people haven't really had an opportunity to look at the data fully, there is still what we would call cautious optimism about this dexamethasone drug, which is a common steroid used in many common conditions like arthritis and severe asthma. And it seems to be having a big impact in terms of reducing case fatalities by up to a third, which is really quite tremendous if that's true. And of course, there are other things that play in, things like cultural differences. The Brits are less inclined to gather in large families, to attend mass at church. The Italians very famously are into their large family gatherings, and with being a very Catholic country, their regular large church gatherings, and they do wonder if that sort of thing has contributed to the number of cases seen in those sorts of countries. Now, I thought I won't talk about the management of it because it's changing all the time. Actually, it's changing daily. But I will just briefly talk to you about the immune system, because the immune system is key with this virus. It is key for all of us, because our immune systems, regardless of our health conditions, will play a very important part in how we tackle this disease, how we fight it. And our immune system is made up of two parts. It comprises our innate response, our body's physical response, things, how we respond physically with, having a cough, having a temperature, having a lot of mucus. And then we have our adaptive response. And our adaptive response is basically all the chemical battles going on in our body, with our white cells, our spleen, and our thymus glands. So that's the silent work going on that's vitally important in our bodies to stop the cytokine storm from taking over and causing serious illness, if not sadly death. Now, in terms of key players in the immune system, well, of course, those of you who listen to my diet podcast will know and understand that our gut microbiome is key. Our gut accounts for 80% of our immune system. It's where we absorb all our stuff, and that stuff is then absorbed into the blood. So it's really important at this time, as well as any other time, but especially at this time, to really think about the quality of your diet. And if you think that it could be improved, then it's a good time to consider improving it. Our immunity tends to be stronger in the morning, and that's partly related to getting a good night's sleep. And again, our sleep podcast went through all the quite incredible physical benefits of getting a good quality sleep. In terms of boosting your immune system, you can improve your diet, as I've already said. Vitamin C can help, zinc. In those who think you may be vitamin D deprived, and that particularly applies to people who are non-white, so those with darker skin are more likely to have lower natural vitamin D levels. And it has been shown in some studies, particularly in South Asian hospitals, that people who were more likely to succumb to the virus were latterly found to have very low levels of vitamin D in their blood. And there's a professor of medicine over at Harvard, and some of our own gastroenterologists in this country as well, who recommend that people who think they might fall into vulnerable category take vitamin D. Also, exercising is very good for you. Again, my exercise podcast explains a lot about that. It improves your mood, but it also improves your immune system. If you remember, I talked about how it increases your natural killer cells. So, all those fantastic exercise classes that you're doing with the physios in the morning, keep that up. Keep up your other activities as well. Don't just make that your 30 minutes a day of movement. Also, sleep is known to boost your immune system. So maybe if you think that you're troubled by sleep, it's worth trying to improve your sleep habits or your daytime habits that can thereby improve your sleep. And again, if you haven't seen the podcast on that, you may find some useful tips in there as to how you can improve your sleep. Sadly, stress is a very important player in our immunity because it suppresses our immune system. So, you know, easier said than done dealing with stress, but I will talk a little bit about stress and anxiety towards the end of this podcast this afternoon. And don't forget anti-inflammatories, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin or um, ibuprofen, perhaps aspirin less so, but particularly ibuprofen, diclofenac drugs like Voltarol, Nurofen. There's some evidence that may worsen the virus. So if you think you're getting a temperature or a headache, reach for the paracetamols rather than the anti-inflammatory drugs like your Nurofens. Briefly, in terms of anxieties, nothing in our training um, prepares us as doctors uh, how we can help people with anxiety during something like a pandemic. But, I will give you some information later, which hopefully will give you some tips as how you might be able to manage your or understand the source of your anxieties better. We have we're in a very unusual situation because unlike war, where people would gather to fight a common enemy, we're presented with an invisible enemy. Even a kind act of a neighbour bringing a um, a parcel of food across to you, there may be the hidden enemy of the virus sat in that parcel of food, so it's something that's very difficult to deal with because it is so invisible. And we have absolutely no idea, where it is. And our system is seriously being stress tested at the moment. Um, a bit like, when you have a problem with a tight muscle or a hamstring injury, and it may not be evident until you perhaps move particularly very quickly in a certain way. You think, oh, I actually have an injury. I didn't realize I did. And in a way, this period of stress we're under is testing us. And for some of us, it's making us more aware of just how anxious we are. Um, so, um, and it's sometimes only at these sort of times that we appreciate the true condition of our inner emotions when it's tested to excess. So if you've noticed that you're stressed and anxious through this pandemic, just attempt awareness, being aware of your inner thoughts and feelings, and asking yourself how you really feel. Because actually what we tend to do is we tend to distract ourselves from the truth of our anxieties, whether purely about the virus or more commonly how it exposes any other deeper insecurities. So what we're finding is those who are already anxious are going to be feeling even more anxious. Those who didn't think they were anxious are now recognizing that, oh, actually, I think I finally I'm more irritable and more anxious. And it can, as I've just said, it can present as irritability or being sucked into like watching constant news coverage, anything you can do to just try and make more sense and feel more safe, so all these things can be suggesting that actually you're more anxious and not and uncomfortable and feeling under duress and stress. Maybe instead of snapping or getting tearful at those occasions, maybe try and be honest and explain your thoughts and feelings behind your emotional responses, whether it has to be to yourself or whether it's to somebody close to you. If you're a parent, you're entitled to some time out to give your emotions some space and acknowledge vulnerability, taking your foot off that sympathetic nervous system pedal that's accelerating you into an even more sort of anxious stress state. And at times like that, it may be worth just saying, hey, I need a little bit of time out. I'm feeling a bit stressed. Go out, take a walk if you need to, play some music. But you are stressed. So be mindful, be aware of how your emotions are playing at this point in time. And the other thing is to breathe. Our mind is the king of our senses, but our breath is the king of our mind. And I shall talk a little bit about that later. I thought I would just discuss the government.uk actual wording as regarding this easing of restrictions. And then I'm going to tell you what some of the leading experts in the field of epidemiology and understanding of viral disease have said in response to this, because of course they're far more expert than I am. Now, the government has said that 2.2 million people are shielding in England, and that they will be able to spend more time outdoors from Monday, the 1st of June. And I understand, having just seen today's news, that they're going to review that again at the beginning of July. Now, the guidance is to be updated to allow interaction outside with their household. And we also understand that you can form bubbles with other household members as well. Um, they talk about an unprecedented package of support for those shielding from coronavirus, which they say is also set to continue. Um, they say you are able to go outside with members of your household while you continue to follow social distancing guidelines. And at the moment, that social distancing still remains at 2 meters, though they are reviewing it to see if they can reduce it to 1 meter, mainly because they're trying to get businesses up and running again. Um, they also say that those who live alone can meet outside with one other person from another household. So you've got some concerns and queries about this, and you're not the only one. If it makes you feel better, you're really not the only one, because this came out, but there was absolutely no explanation, no reason, because we haven't got the R number where we want it. There's still a lot of cases coming every day and still deaths every day. And it's probably for a lot of you just doesn't make sense. So Dr. Stephen Griffin, who is Associate Professor in the School of Medicine, University of Leeds, said the announcement of relaxed measures for those most at risk from severe COVID-19, the shielders, seems to lack any obvious rationale other than to add to ongoing good news narrative that appears to have little grounding in reality. So that's the first response that came out. He also went on to say, as we have heard from Professor Van Tam, who's a very key player in policy making throughout this pandemic, members of SAGE, and you've all heard of SAGE, and its unofficial counterpart, and numerous other of the scientific community, the daily case incidence, death rate, and RO number in the UK does not represent a controlled, safe scenario. Testing, track and trace, and isolating protocols are still being established and are largely untested on the scale necessary to ensure a safe route out of lockdown. Moreover, other relaxation measures recently announced mean that those venturing out will likely face difficulties in ensuring social distancing, and that the virus is markedly more prevalent in the UK compared with when lockdown was first implemented. So basically, what he's saying is that, you know, we're focusing a lot on the R number, but we don't understand that the R number is, as I said earlier, it's going to keep coming back up unless we do further things to make sure that we cut off groups that are starting to become infectious again before they then spread it, and we end up with widespread disease spread. So the importance of the track and trace of testing is key, and the feeling is at the moment that this is not robust enough, and of course we know it's changing on a daily basis. So basically that is what he said. He went on to say that what appears lacking from this, as well as other relaxation measures announced recently, is a clear explanation of precisely why it's felt that the situation justifies such actions. It's felt that risk has somehow been mitigated despite ongoing virus circulation. He asks, Does the government consider that increasing social interactions are unlikely to maintain or increase case incidence? Have other considerations now become more significant compared to the risk of those most vulnerable contracting the virus? And of course, this is an important point because at the end of the day, it's going to be a political decision. And as he rightly says, we all recognise the socio-economic pressure to restore a sense of normality amidst the crisis. But the long-term implications to an extended pandemic are severe. So, I mean, it's a trade-off, isn't it, really, between the impact of our current social economic situation on our children who are unable to return to school, on people who are unable to possibly ever go back to their job if their job's no longer available, to basically the huge strain it's having on our GDP and how it's trashing our economy at the moment, and and how that can also have an ongoing impact on people's health and well-being. That versus the possibility of an extended epidemic by not uh, imposing and maintaining stricter conditions at this stage. It's a tricky one. And it wasn't just the professor, Stephen, who said this. So this is really representing what this body of people who are very much from the scientific community have been saying. He also goes on to say we must also consider the effects that this announcement might have upon those currently shielding. So this is actually aimed directly at you, which is why I put this in. How, without a clear rationale, are shielders supposed to judge whether it is indeed safe for them to alter their behaviour? The perception for many will be that it's safe, but this can also apply considerable emotional pressure to those most vulnerable to either comply or to repeatedly have to justify why they might not feel comfortable now seeing their loved ones or leaving the relative safety of their homes. Furthermore, should measures be further relaxed, shielders may experience difficulties relating to the workplace or childcare that were previously covered by simple criteria. So, it is putting a lot of pressure on those who are shielding to make those difficult decisions, because obviously you want to see your loved ones, but you have your fears, anxieties, and concerns, and also you don't feel like there's anything that's notably changed that makes you feel more safe to drop your guard that bit. So I put that in because I thought that it may well reflect how many of you are feeling. Now, Professor Sally Bloomfield, who's honorary professor of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, has also said in response that yesterday Jonathan Van Tam warned that abusing new liberties would fuel the spread of infection, and said that the lifting of curbs should be treated as if gently lifting the lid on a coil spring, painstakingly slow. Said, and she fully agrees with Professor Van Tam, the country is at a very dangerous moment in the crisis where things could swing either way. In reality, the option to meet with non-household members in private gardens is only a small extension of meeting in public parks. But my fear is that it is not being seen this way. I had a number of telephone calls from media over the weekend asking me to comment on the announcement that from Monday we can start having barbecues again, which for those who do not directly listen to government announcement implies something very much less restrained, i.e. we can start socialising again. It means we are going to have a hammer home the message of personal responsibility for maintaining physical distancing and hand contact surface hygiene. If we want to sustain this activity as well as sustaining our value below 1. Now, I mean, that is actually happening. I have friends who live in London who say when they go walking in the local parks, say Hampstead Heath, that there are large gatherings of people up to 30, no social distancing, out with their barbecues, out acting like it's a normal summer's day. And this is being replicated all over the country. People having barbecues in their back garden, inviting multiple people from different households around. So, and unfortunately, there's also the Dominic Cummings effect as well. Where people are saying, "Well, if he can do it, then so can we." So, unfortunately, um, the guidance that has been put out is not being strictly followed, and that's just how it is. Now, GPs have also criticised the advice that's come out from UK Gov. They say that it was changed without consulting them, and it didn't make clear whether vulnerable people could now receive treatment in surgeries. And I know that many of you will have concerns about that because, you know, many of you will, for example, have regular tests that you would take, like blood pressure reviews, or maybe that you're diabetic, or your annual health check review. So, and there's really been no guidance about that, about whether you, as a vulnerable person, can now receive such treatment in surgeries. There's also other groups, including relatives, residents associations, people who represent care homes, um, and also campaign groups like the campaigners from groups like Muscular Dystrophy, who are all expressing concerns. And they're kind of, I suppose, a little bit conflicted because they're also aware of the effect that this is having on the fear that the whole of this pandemic is engendering on people's mental health, and but they feel that this move has come faster than expected, and that it's done nothing to mitigate that fear, and if anything, it's made it worse because now it's adding that personal responsibility that I mentioned earlier, which puts even more pressure on people as to, well, what's the right thing to do. So at the end of all this, I mean, all I've done probably right now is just reflected back at you what you're all feeling. And if you want my opinion as to what you should do, then I think your response will depend on what level of risk you feel is right for you and what you are prepared to accept. Like life itself, it's often about balancing risk versus benefit. Now, I've just noticed that my screen's gone blank again, but my husband hasn't said anything, so I'm presuming that the video is still running, so I shall carry on. Um, so, in terms of your response, well, it will depend on whether you very much feel that you're not prepared to take any risk at all. And I know that there are people out there who've said, until we have a vaccine, or until everybody can be tested, and we know if we have had it and we're protected, then we will not stop shielding, and they're prepared to stay in lockdown for as long as it takes, and that's a decision they've made, and that's their brains processed it as the way that they are most likely to feel safe. Now, for others of you, you will be considering relative risk, and this will be based on your age, risk factors that you might feel you have in concurrence to your stroke, other risk factors, your current level of health. You may feel that actually your health is pretty good despite your stroke, and that you feel like you keep yourself fit and well, and that you don't and you don't perhaps fall into the very old group, or perhaps you don't feel, well, I'm not from the BAME community, or maybe you are from the BAME community but you don't feel particularly concerned. Whatever it is, there will be other factors which will play in to your decision as to whether you are prepared to take a relative risk of relaxing or easing your personal restrictions. And of course, it will also depend on whether you feel that you can maintain a safe distance from the people that you wish to visit. Because, of course, if you are planning to get into contact with people who are perhaps confused, elderly confused with dementia, or perhaps people who have learning difficulties, then that maybe present a more of a problem in terms of how can you communicate with those people that yes, you're going to see them, but we have to keep this distance, and that may indeed play into your decision about easing your own restrictions. And of course, there are additional key players which we mustn't forget. They are very important because these involve how destructive you might personally feel this whole lockdown has been to your own physical and mental well-being. You know, for some of you, I know you have been completely isolated during this time and are really struggling with it, and I'm very sad about that, and I'm sorry to hear it, and I really hope for you that your struggle and your suffering is eased as soon as possible. And there will be others of you who may be living with family members but who have real problems with your mental health right now, and or who are really struggling with inability to socialize and to talk with people other than whoever's in your home. And this could be really impacting on your health, both your physical and your mental health. And it may be that you make that decision that the concerns for your health, physically and mentally, is greater than the danger of getting COVID, and that you're prepared to take the risk of easing your restrictions and social distance, meeting other people from their households, because you know that it will improve your overall health, and that will in some way also reduce your chance of becoming critically ill were you to get COVID, because at least your body is in a better state, because you feel better about yourself and happier, less socially isolated, less lonely, less miserable, you know, moving more, just generally feeling more like you're living. So as I said earlier, there is nothing that prepares a doctor to talk about anxiety and stress, really, not in our training. But, you know, as you know from my previous podcasts, I have done a lot of reading around the subjects. And, you know, if you want the sort of the medical term, I suppose, for stress, basically it's a mismatch between external demands on us and our inner ability to cope. Resilience to stress varies depending on our memories, our experiences, our tolerance to change, and the sensitivity of something called a hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And that's the thing that basically creates our fight and flight response. You know, we're more prone to it nowadays because we're as a society less exposed to death and to serious events, life-changing events at a particularly young age. In other words, to loss. You know, they've done studies that show that those people who have pets as children tend to suffer less because pets don't tend to live as long as humans. So, you know, an 8 to 12 year lifespan. And so, you know, a lot of children who have experienced the death of a pet have had an early exposure, and there's a sort of an well, what was noticed basically is that they do seem to show an increased resilience. Cultural differences play into it as well, like your faith. So, for example, I was listening to a podcast by a GP who's an ex-soldier, who, when he was on active duty in Kuwait, was called to a minefield. Two teenage lads who'd had their legs blown off, and he found them lying there, sort of very calm, believe it or not, just repeating over and over in sort of slow, deep breaths, inshallah, inshallah, which basically is if Allah wills it, or if God wills it. So faith can be a key player, and our childhood is a key player as well, as to regarding whether we feel, you know, whether we felt so safe and nourished mentally and physically. And it also plays into, you know, our exposure and our handling of difficult situations, or how we saw our parents handling difficult situations and children, what it taught us. So there's lots of factors that play into our resilience when we're presented with stress. And as I said earlier, this is unlike any war. This is we're fighting an invisible enemy. It's a common enemy still, but it's invisible. So it's more tricky, you know, to really understand how or to recognize it, or to feel that you can be proactive the way you would traditionally be proactive in a war-like situation. I said earlier about, you know, how there are those of us who who are already anxious and are becoming more anxious, those of us who perhaps didn't realize we were anxious, but this stress test has made us think, oh, actually we are anxious. And so, and there are those also who are just sort of getting very sort of focused on watching news coverage and events and being more irritable perhaps or moody. And so, if you feel that it's presenting any way in any of these ways in yourself, um, maybe as I said, instead of getting snappy and tearful, be honest and explain, to yourself or to those around you how you're feeling. Just be in touch yourself with how your emotional your emotional um, responses right now. It's really important, and also bear in mind that yes, stress is very necessary short term, but when it's chronic, it's like a runaway train. It it's basically it's where our autonomic nervous system stays in the sympathetic sort of pathway, and that's the one that keeps the accelerator on. It takes over. But I just want to finish by saying, we can control our autonomic nervous system response, and we can thereby reduce any physical or psychological discomfort that you might be feeling related to being stressed and anxious. Uh, if you want some more details on that, you can revisit the podcast I did on social isolation and loneliness, or indeed the podcast I did on stress in particular. So the first of the two things I'm going to talk about is visual refocusing. So you can, if you feel that you're starting to get heightened anxiety, or you feel that you're not in a good place, try and focus on something in the distance is always really good, because it really gets the brain to reduce its level of anxiety. It just switches off all those sympathetic pathways. Looking at something like a tree or something pleasant, whether it's the sky, clouds in the distance, and then maybe even look at something very close up. So you're doing very close, detailed analysis of even a leaf or a flower or even the palm of your hand. Just it's distracting techniques, and it can help in acute situations. The other thing, of course, I've already mentioned is breathing. Our mind, yes, and the stories we tell is the king of our senses, but it is our breath which is the king of our mind. And you know, our breath basically tells our brain what state we're in. And so, and our brain will then respond in kind. So if we're breathing shallow or fast, then our brain thinks, okay, danger, being attacked. We need to get everything firing, everything pumping, everything flowing. But if our breathing is slow and regular, then our brain will say, okay, that's okay, we're safe. And remember that our brain, because it has to remember, because our brain receives thousands of inputs every second, it has to filter out that which is important and that which isn't. And the key players that decide, that make it sort of wake up and take notice, is this something that makes me feel safe? Is this something that I really need? So if your breathing slows down, then your brain will filter that out and say, okay, whatever else is going on around me, I know that I'm safe. And the way you can do that is to just practice stillness. I'm not talking sitting cross-legged, muttering chants or anything like that. I'm talking about just sitting in any position that's comfortable for you, or lying, and just practicing being still. And while you're doing that, to really focus on your breathing, get it slow and regular, and you will notice that your brain will pick that up, and it will slow all those anxious, stressful, physiological changes that are going on. It will slow those down, and it will also allow you to think more clearly as well, which is probably something you will all need to be doing right now as you make your decision as how to make head or tail of the most recent guidance from the government on those of you who are shielding. So, on that note, I hope you stay safe over the next few months. I really do. And apologies for the early little hiccup with on the technical side. To say, my husband informed me we'd lost sound. Apparently we haven't. And I'll see you again at the end of August, hopefully at the other end of my exams. And take care, everyone. Bye for now.